MG Rob back with you, and today we're doing steering rack seals, or bellows if you will, and tie rod boots on the 70 Jag E-type. So if you saw the video where I was first looking at this car, you'll notice that the rack boot was ripped apart on this side, and actually the tie rod boots weren't that great as well. So we're going to be replacing those. Now, before you do anything, it's a good idea to go ahead and mark this. I like lumber crayons. They don't wipe off quite as easily as grease pencil, but they're not as permanent as like paint marker. So you want to put a mark here and right up the tie rod and the steering shaft there. That's something that you can count the turns off of later. And we also want to start out by loosening this nut before we break this loose to make sure that everything will move. In this case, this has nylock nuts on it, not a collar pin through there. So we just take the old dac. Take that off. And then I got my little tie rod tool here. I like this thing. Works really nice. Sure beats trying to beat on it with a hammer or use a pickle fork and tearing up the boots if you're trying to save them, which in this case isn't. We aren't, but just that easy. Pops right apart. So then what we want to do is we want to turn this off and count the turns. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 15, 16, 17 turns. Then we want to write that down, which I'll just do here. 17 turns. So we know when we go to put it back on, we put it back on 17 turns, and we should be really, really close in alignment. Since we're actually putting the old ones back on, it should be right. We shouldn't have to change anything. And we got to take the adjustment nut off. And then we can take the clamp loose for the outer side of the boot. And then this will come off. Now we gotta get the inside off, which is a little bit more difficult because we got these electric fans here. You can't see it too well, but the bolt for the end of the bolt here is sticking straight up. This bracket that holds the fans is covering that over, so you can't get to it. So what we're going to have to do here, I'm going to have to take these bars loose and see if the radiator will tip forward just enough to get in there. The last time I did this was on a car that had been sitting for 30 some odd years. And we already had the radiator out getting it record because it was rotted out. So that's what we're going to do here, or at least try to do. We'll see how it works. So in order to get enough movement out of this, you actually have to, there's 2 nuts on the bottom for studs that go through rubber bushings. So you got to at least loosen those to give them a chance to maneuver. And then depending on your car and how long these hoses are, which I'm going to say almost every time, you're going to have to take them loose. In our case, it was no issue because the system's already empty because we put some cooling hoses in it and we're going to be flushing it out. But then we can flex this thing forward just enough to be able to get down in here and actually loosen that clamp. And we got it off. Now I just need to clean all this stuff up here. Now it's a good idea while you're in here to check how this feels. Make sure there's not a lot of movement in there and it's not super sloppy. And it's showing a lot of wear. Now if we're taking the boot off here, it's really just as easy as popping it off here. It might take a screwdriver to pop it off, but in this case it's ripped enough it just pops right off. I'm going to go ahead and clean all this stuff up, and then when we put it all together, re-grease everything. All right, so now we're ready to start putting this back together. So I got the new boot here. And one thing you'll notice about these is these boots here, the inside diameter is actually a little bit smaller than the end of the rack. And that's necessary so that you get a good seal. But it also makes it a little bit difficult to push it up over the rack sometimes, because you kind of need to spread this, but you really, especially in this, it's hard to get your hand in there and do anything with it. So what I do, once I get in there, is you start that bottom lip, get the bottom on there as best you can. You go in there with something like this. Now, it'd be nice not to have something that's got as much of a tip as this, but this is what I've got. And be careful with pulling that up and around to get it up onto the rack. And you'll notice it's actually a lot smaller than that out of the inner tie rod here. So you got to get it up over that first. And then start at the bottom. Oh, actually it's going on really good on this side. I'd already done the other side, and the other side was a real pain in the butt, and this side just slid right on. So, surprise! Here I tell you how difficult it is, and it just goes. But what I'm going to do here, put this on, clamp on here, I'm going to do this a little bit different than the way it was done. We're going to throw this on here so that the screw is facing straight down, where I got a much easier time of being able to tighten this thing. And anybody in the future who has to work on it and might have to play with these later will have a much easier time of it. Because we can just come right in through the bottom here. And as soon as I find the slot here, that way, this is not in the way to even just to get a screwdriver into it, like we had getting it apart. So then we tighten this up and move on to the outer one. And yes, I'm reusing the clamps that were on it, which this one's a little out of shape. Like we said, this is a driver. He's not worried about this stuff being like super pretty. And quite frankly, it's hard to find the right size clamps without spending, you know, good money on stuff, because regular worm style clamps are actually a little too wide, and the proper clamps are relatively expensive for their size. But there's that. And then we can go ahead and put our jam nut back on. Then we take our tie rod here. We can put the new boot on, That's where you can use this and just kind of pull that around, get that on there. And then remember we had 17 turns. So it's 1, 2, 3, 16, 17. So that should put us really close. And then we just put this back in here, and you can just give it a little, whoops, give it a little pop there to get it to hold. Put the nut back on it, and forgot to get my little ugga-dugga here. And like I said, all I gotta do is tighten up this other clamp, and we can go ahead and grease it. You can go back to the factory manual. They actually just show grease, not like 90 weight oil like on an MGB or an MGA or a T-Series. So we grease that up through the nipple that's on the other side there. Then we can put the wheels on it, put it back on the ground, and check the toe end and adjust that. All right, so now I got the rack's all greased up, wheels back on it, it's on the ground here, and we're ready to check the toe in on it. Now I got these bars here I made many years ago. They got slots in them right here, and that is so you can put a tape measure right inside of here and measure either end. And it goes up high enough on the sidewall to get a good even measurement. You just want to get 2 tape measures that are the same. It doesn't have to be anything special. It doesn't matter if they're cheap tapes, good tapes, whatever. You just want them to be the same. If you want to double check them to make sure, you can just hook both of them and just double check, make sure they line up to each other. I got 2 sets of these bars, 2 different heights, and it depends which height I use depends on how low the exhaust system is and stuff, and what it's going to hit underneath the car. We want them as high as we can get them and still get the tapes to not hit anything. So we run this on under here and get an assistant on the other side, hooking the tapes on the front and the back. We take a measurement. We see what we got here. So I got 59 and 11/16 on this side, and 59 and 5/16 up here, which means I'm towed in just a little bit more than we want to be. So then what I would do is then go on in there and adjust the rack, turning the inside, the inner tie rod, till I get it out some. And we want to push the car back and forth and then check it again until we got what we want. And at the same time, if the steering wheel is just slightly off center, you can adjust just the one side only to get it centered, and then go test drive it in between and make sure that the steering wheel is centered. And once we get that done, we want to get it to where it's about, with these bars, roughly between 16th and 30th, or 16th and an 1/8 range difference in measurements, with narrow in the front so it's towed in just slightly, and you won't get excessive tire wear. And then that'll be done with that. And then all we got to do is a couple small details of this thing. It'll be buttoned up, ready to go back to the customer. Because I don't know if you can tell on the video here, but I've already buffed the car out. That was one thing he wanted me to do real quick. Paint was a little hazy. Got it all buffed out and ready to go. We got his new battery. This is just a battery out of my Jeep because his battery was dead. Got to throw his new battery in there, and this car will be done. So I figured since I buffed the paint out, I'd do a quick walk around of it. So it does look a lot better than when it showed up. But there it is. Beautiful cars. They weren't so expensive and so hard to work on. I'd love to have one for myself. Of course, you got that big old 6 sounding pretty sweet there. So he'll be picking this thing up probably within the next hour or two, and maybe we'll see it again, maybe we won't.